The great chronological heist. Did the Middle Ages exist? Have you ever felt like history is just a little bit off? Like there are gaps in the story of humanity that don't quite add up. Imagine waking up tomorrow to find out the date on your phone is fundamentally wrong. Not just by a few hours, but by 297 years. If we take the phantom time hypothesis seriously, the year isn't 2026, it's actually 1729. This isn't a plot for a Hollywood sci-fi blockbuster. It's a provocative and mind-bending theory proposed by German historian Heribert Illig in the 1980s. He suggested that a massive chunk of the early Middle Ages, specifically from 614 to 911 AD, was simply fabricated. That's 3 centuries of kings, epic battles, and cultural shifts deleted from reality. According to Illig, this wasn't an accident, but a grand conspiracy involving emperors and popes who wanted to fast forward to the milestone year 1000 to legitimize their divine right to rule. In this deep dive, we aren't going to get bogged down in dry philosophy or dense academic jargon. Instead, we're going to act like time detectives. We'll be investigating ghost architecture, missing archaeological layers, and a calendar glitch that left the world confused for centuries. We are going to explore this horizontally, mapping out the weird, the wonderful, and the downright suspicious evidence across the globe that suggests our timeline might be a masterpiece of fiction. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and subscribe to join our journey through the anomalies of time. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. The visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. You can just sit back, listen, and let the mystery of the stolen centuries unfold. The mystery of the missing 300 years. The core of our investigation rests on a simple yet haunting question. How can 3 centuries of human activity just vanish? If you dig into the ground in most parts of Europe, you'll find Roman artifacts, and if you dig a little higher, you'll find high Middle Ages ruins. But in between, there is often a strange, silent void. We are about to find out if that void is a coincidence or the smoking gun of history's greatest forgery. The mystery of the numbers on the calendar. A 10-day glitch or a 300-year lie? To understand how 3 centuries might have been completely fabricated, we have to look at the one thing we all trust implicitly but rarely question: the calendar. We treat time like a steady, unyielding river, but for most of human history, keeping track of that river was a messy, imprecise, and deeply political business. If you want to pull off a heist of 300 years, you don't start with the buildings or the kings, you start with the math. The problem with perfect circles. Imagine you are Julius Caesar. The year is 46 BC and your empire is a mess, not just politically, but chronologically. The old Roman calendar was so out of sync with the seasons that harvest festivals were happening in the middle of winter. Caesar, being a man of action, decided to fix it. He consulted the best astronomers of the time and created the Julian calendar. The logic was simple and for the time brilliant. The astronomers knew the Earth took about 365.25 days to orbit the Sun. To account for that extra quarter, they added a leap day every 4 years. It seemed perfect, it was elegant, it was Roman. But there was a tiny microscopic flaw. A year isn't exactly 365.25 days, it is actually closer to 365.24219 days. That difference is roughly 11 minutes and 14 seconds per year. In the grand scheme of a human life, 11 minutes is nothing. It's the time it takes to brew a pot of coffee or wait for a bus. But history doesn't think in human lives, it thinks in centuries. The snowball effect of 11 minutes. If you lose 11 minutes every year, you lose a full day every 128 years. By the time the Middle Ages were in full swing, the calendar and the actual position of the Earth in space were drifting apart. By the late 1500s, the human calendar was nearly 2 weeks out of sync with the cosmic calendar. For the average farmer, this was annoying. They would look at the calendar and see it was time to plant, but the frost was still on the ground. However, for the Catholic Church, this was a spiritual crisis. The most important date in the Christian world, Easter, is calculated based on the spring equinox. If the equinox was drifting, the Church was celebrating its holiest day on the wrong date. To the Vatican, this wasn't just a math error, it was a risk to the soul of Christendom. Enter Pope Gregory XIII, the man who deleted. October. By 1582, Pope Gregory XIII decided he had seen enough. He gathered a team of elite astronomers led by Christopher Clavius to fix Caesar's mistake. Their solution was the Gregorian calendar, the very system we use today. To fix the drift and ensure it didn't happen again, they tweaked the leap year rule. Years divisible by 100 wouldn't be leap years unless they were also divisible by 400. It was a clever bit of engineering that brought the error down to just a few seconds a year. But there was still the issue of the drift that had already happened since the time of Caesar. To reset the clock, the Pope did something radical. He issued a decree. In October 1582, the world would simply skip 10 days. People went to sleep on Thursday, October 4th, and woke up on Friday, October 15th. Imagine the chaos if you had a debt due on the 10th. Was it still due? If your birthday was on October 7th, did you just not age that year? There were reports of riots in the streets. People felt the church was literally stealing days from their lives. They called them the stolen days. The deadly math of Heribert Illig. Now this is where our mystery truly begins. This is where Heribert Illig, our time detective, walks into the room with a magnifying glass and a smirk. Illig looked at the Pope's 10-day correction and did some basic math. Remember, the Julian calendar loses 1 day every 128 years. If the Julian calendar had been running since it was established in 46 BC until the reform in 1582 AD, that's a span of about 1,628 years. Let's do the math. 128 years per day, 1,628 years, approximately 12.7 days. According to the laws of astronomy, by 1582, the calendar should have been off by 13 days. So, why did the Pope only skip 10 days? Illig's answer is as simple as it is terrifying. The Pope only needed to skip 10 days because 300 years of history never actually happened. If you remove 3 centuries from the timeline, the 10-day correction fits perfectly. If those 300 years, roughly the years between 614 and 911 AD, were real, the Pope would have been forced to delete 13 days to get the seasons back in line. By only deleting 10, the Vatican, perhaps unknowingly or perhaps as part of the cover-up, provided the mathematical proof that our timeline is bloated. The Phantom era, think about what sits in that 300-year window. We are talking about the early Middle Ages, often called the Dark Ages. It's a period where, in Europe at least, the lights seem to go out. The grand stone cities of the Romans were replaced by wooden huts. Literacy plummeted. Record-keeping became the exclusive domain of a few monks in isolated monasteries. If you were going to hide a few centuries of fake history, this would be the perfect place to do it. It's a period of darkness where nobody was looking, and the few people who could write were all working for the same bosses, the kings and the popes. Why fake 300 years? The year 1000 fever. You might ask, why? What is the point of inventing 3 centuries of struggle, famine, and obscure kings? In the mindset of the Middle Ages, the year 1000 AD was a magical, terrifying number. It was the millennium. Many believed it would bring the second coming of Christ or the end of the world. For a ruler, being the emperor at the dawn of the year 1000 wasn't just a political title, it was a divine endorsement. It made you the millennial king. According to the phantom time hypothesis, Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II and possibly the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII wanted to live in that glorious year. But they were stuck in the boring late 700s. So they did what any absolute ruler with a team of creative monks would do. They edited the books. They filled the gap with fictional heroes, legendary battles, and complex lineages to bridge the gap from where they were to where they wanted to be. A world of disconnected timelines. To make this horizontal investigation work, we have to look at how the rest of the world reacted to the calendar change. The Gregorian reform wasn't accepted overnight. While Catholic countries like Italy, Spain, and France jumped 10 days ahead, immediately Protestant and Orthodox countries refused. They thought it was a popish plot. England didn't switch until 1752. By then the drift had increased, so they had to skip 11 days. Russia didn't switch until after their revolution in 1918, requiring a skip of 13 days. This staggered adoption of the calendar created a period of global chronological chaos. For over 300 years, if you travelled from London to Paris, you weren't just changing your currency, you were literally travelling through time. You could leave London on a Tuesday and arrive in Paris on a Friday, even if the trip only took a few hours. This historical mess shows us just how flexible and made up our dates really are. If we can't even agree on what day it is today, how can we be so certain about what happened 1,400 years ago? The missing archaeological layer. If Illig is right about the calendar math, we should see the evidence in the ground, and this is where the theory gets its scientific teeth for the layperson. In archaeology, there is a concept called stratigraphy. Think of it like a layer cake. The bottom layer is the oldest, the Romans, and the top layer is the newest, us. Usually, you expect to see a continuous build-up of trash, coins, and foundation stones. But in many parts of Europe, there is a silent layer. You find late Roman pottery from around 600 AD, and then directly on top of it, or with very little in between, you find artifacts from the 900s. It's as if the people of Europe stopped eating, stopped breaking plates, and stopped losing coins for 300 years, only to suddenly start again. The social logic of the lie. We also have to consider the horizontal spread of information back then. There was no internet, there were no newspapers. If the local count and the local priest told you it was the year 800, you believed them. You had no way to check. If they said, hey, remember your great-great-grandfather who fought for the great King Charlemagne? You nodded along, even if Charlemagne was a character invented by a monk 50 miles away 20 years ago. The phantom time wasn't just a math error, it was a narrative tool. By creating a glorious past like the era of Charlemagne, rulers in the present, the 900s, could justify their power. They were claiming a legacy that, according to Illig, was built on a foundation of empty air and ink. Preliminary conclusion of the numbers. As we wrap up this first deep dive into the numbers, we are left with a staggering mathematical coincidence. The 10-day gap of Pope Gregory XIII perfectly matches a timeline that is 300 years shorter than the one we are taught in school. Was it a simple mistake by the Vatican's astronomers? Did they just decide that 10 was a rounder number than 13? Or did they know that the history books they were referencing had been padded by 3 centuries of ghost years? As we move forward, we're going to step away from the math and look at the people who inhabit these missing years. Most notably, we're going to look at the Elvis of the Middle Ages, Charlemagne, a man so perfect, so busy, and so influential that he might just be too good to be true. If the calendar is the how of the crime, Charlemagne might be the who. But before we get to him, we have to ask ourselves, if you were to delete 300 years of your own family history, would anyone notice? Probably not if you controlled the pens. Stay with me, because the rabbit hole is about to get a lot deeper as we move from the numbers on a page to the cold, hard stone of the cathedrals. Charlemagne, the superstar who wasn't there. If the phantom time hypothesis is a heist movie, then Charlemagne is the primary suspect, or rather, he is the magnificent gold-plated distraction. To the mainstream history books, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, is the father of Europe. He's the man who supposedly pulled the continent out of the mud, united warring tribes, and was crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800 AD. But if you look at the evidence through the lens of a skeptic, Charlemagne starts to look less like a historical figure and more like a medieval version of a superhero. He's too perfect, too busy, and his fingerprints are strangely missing from the very world he supposedly built. The overachiever problem. Let's start with the sheer math of Charlemagne's life. According to the records, mostly written by a monk named Einhard years after the fact, Charlemagne reigned for about 46 years. During that time, he reportedly led over 50 major military campaigns. Think about the logistics of the 9th century. There were no highways, no GPS, and no canned rations. Moving an army of thousands of men, horses, and supply wagons through the dense, swampy forests of Germany and over the frozen peaks of the Alps was a monumental task. To lead 50 campaigns means he was essentially at war every single year of his adult life, often in 2 or 3 different corners of Europe at once. While he was doing this, he also supposedly reformed the entire legal system of the Frankish Empire, standardized weights and measures across thousands of miles, launched a Carolingian renaissance of art and literature, created a new script, Carolingian minuscule, which is the ancestor of the lowercase letters you are reading right now, built a massive palace complex at Aachen, complete with a groundbreaking cathedral, managed a complex family life with multiple wives and dozens of children. In a world where it took a week for a letter to travel 100 miles, this level of productivity isn't just great, it's bordering on the impossible. Illig argues that Charlemagne's life is a composite narrative. He's a legendary figure created by later rulers to serve as a perfect mythic ancestor. He is the King Arthur of Germany and France, except we've been told he was actually real. The Aachen anomaly. Architecture. Out of time. Now let's talk about the bricks and mortar. If you go to Aachen, Germany today, you can visit the Palatine Chapel, the centerpiece of Charlemagne's supposed empire. It is a stunning building, an octagon of stone and mosaic that looks like it belongs in Constantinople or Ravenna. But here's the problem. Architecturally, the Palatine Chapel is a freak. Before this chapel was built, European architecture was primitive. We're talking about simple wooden halls and basic stone churches. Then suddenly, in the year 796 AD, this masterpiece appears. It features complex domes, massive bronze doors, and intricate marble work. And then this is the weird part, nothing like it is built again for another 200 years. In a normal historical timeline, technology evolves. You see a simple arch, then a better arch, then a dome, but the Carolingian style seems to drop from the sky, stay for a few years, and then vanish without a trace until the Romanesque period in the thousands. Archaeologists have a hard time explaining this technological amnesia. Why would builders forget how to make a dome for 2 centuries? Illig's explanation is simpler. The chapel wasn't built in 800 AD. It was built much later, or it was a renovated Roman structure. And the 300-year gap between it and the next big building doesn't exist because the years themselves don't exist. The missing trash of the empire science is often about the things we don't find. In archaeology, we rely on stratigraphy, the layers of soil that accumulate over time. When humans live in a place, they leave a cultural layer. They break pots, they lose coins, they drop food, and they build foundations. If you excavate a city like Frankfurt, London, or Paris, you find a very clear Roman layer. Lots of red pottery, coins with emperors' faces, stone roads. Then you find a layer from the late Middle Ages around 1000 to 1100 AD. But for the period of 614 to 911 AD, the heart of the phantom time, the soil is often sterile. There is a famous ceramic gap in Europe. Pottery is the plastic of the ancient world. It's everywhere. Yet for these 300 years, the production of pottery seems to have almost stopped. Did the people of Europe suddenly decide to eat off of wooden planks that rotted away? Or were there simply no people there because those years never happened? Even the coins are suspicious. Charlemagne supposedly reformed the currency and minted thousands of deniers. Yet for a ruler who controlled almost all of Western Europe, the number of his coins found in archaeological primary contexts, meaning found in the layer of dirt where they were actually dropped, is shockingly low compared to the Roman era or the later medieval era. The culture of the pious forgery. To understand how 300 years could be faked, you have to understand the people who were holding the pens, the monks. In the early Middle Ages, literacy was a rare superpower. If you wanted something written down, you went to a monastery. These monks weren't just recording history, they were creating it. They lived in a world where pious forgeries were a standard practice. If a monastery wanted to prove they owned a piece of land and they didn't have the deed, they would simply write one. They would use old-looking parchment, fake the signature of a dead king, and discover it in the archives. They didn't see this as lying, they saw it as correcting the record to reflect spiritual truth. The most famous example is the donation of Constantine. For centuries, the Catholic Church claimed that Emperor Constantine the Great had given the Pope authority over the entire Western Roman Empire. They had a document to prove it. It wasn't until the 15th century that scholars proved the document was a total fake, written hundreds of years after Constantine died. If the Church could fake a document that gave them power over all of Europe, why couldn't they, working with Emperor Otto III, fake a few centuries of history to make themselves look like the legitimate heirs to a grand ancient tradition? The Paper Kings, Louis the Pious, and the crumbling empire. After Charlemagne died in 814 AD, the story of his empire gets even more suspicious. His son, Louis the Pious, supposedly took over, followed by a confusing mess of grandsons who split the empire into 3 parts, the Treaty of Verdun. When you read the chronicles of this period, the characters feel thin. They are often archetypes. You have the pious king, the stammering king, the fat king, and the simple king. Their reigns are filled with endless, repetitive civil wars that seem to go nowhere and leave no physical marks on the landscape. Historians have long noted that the Carolingian Empire seems to dissolve with impossible speed. Within a few decades of the death of the great Charlemagne, everything he built, the schools, the laws, the unity, was gone. Usually, when a civilization makes a massive leap forward in technology and literacy, that progress sticks, but the Carolingian Renaissance supposedly just evaporated. Unless, of course, it was never there to begin with. If the Renaissance was just a literary invention of 10th century monks trying to create a golden age for their patrons, then its sudden disappearance makes perfect sense. You can't lose progress you never actually made. The scientific dead end of dendrochronology for now. Now, a real scientist would point to dendrochronology, the study of tree rings. Trees are like nature's clocks. Each year they grow a ring, and the width of that ring depends on the weather. By overlapping patterns from old buildings and fossilized logs, scientists have built a master timeline that stretches back thousands of years. Mainstream science says the tree rings prove those 300 years happened, but Illig and his supporters have a counter-argument. They point out that the master sequences for the early Middle Ages in Europe are often based on very few samples, sometimes from reused wood or timber found in bogs that is difficult to date precisely. They argue that the timeline has been stretched to fit the written history. If the monks faked the books and the later scientists used those books to help align their tree rings, the error becomes self-reinforcing. It's a circular logic where the fake history protects the fake science. Horizontal context, the life of a ghost soldier. Let's look at this horizontally by imagining a soldier in Charlemagne's army. We are told this man travelled from the heart of France to the plains of Hungary to fight the Avars. He would have needed iron for his sword, leather for his boots, and a constant supply of grain. To support an army of 10,000 such men, you need a massive, functioning economy. You need blacksmith hubs and grain silos and tax collectors. Yet, when we look for the 8th century versions of these things, we find almost nothing. We find 11th century versions. If Charlemagne was real, he was a ghost who led an army of ghosts fed by ghost farms and paid with ghost money. He is a giant of history, but he casts no shadow in the dirt. As we move into the next part of our investigation, we're going to look at the crime scene itself. We'll look at why 3 powerful men, 2 emperors and a pope, might have sat down in a room and decided to delete 300 years of the past to create a future that suited them. We're moving from the who to the why. But before we do, just look at a map of Europe. Almost every major city claims to have been founded or elevated by Charlemagne. He is the ultimate founding father for hire. And in the world of power, a fake father is often more useful than a real one. The silence of the earth. When the dirt refuses to lie. If you want to know the truth about the past, don't ask a politician, and definitely don't ask a monk with a deadline. Ask the dirt. For centuries, the earth beneath our feet has acted like a giant, unintentional hard drive, recording every broken plate, every dropped coin, and every foundation stone laid by our ancestors. This is the field of archaeology, the ultimate CSI unit for history. But when we turn our magnifying glasses toward the years 614 to 911 AD, the archaeological record does something very strange. It goes silent. In many parts of Europe and the Near East, it's as if the hard drive simply stopped recording for 300 years. This isn't just a dark age where we lack writing, it's an era where we often lack stuff. The layer cake of time. Understanding stratigraphy. Before we dig into the specific missing pieces, we need to understand how archaeology works for the average person. Think of a city like Rome or London as a giant layer cake. When people live in a place, they don't just stay at the same level. They build houses, the houses fall down, they spread gravel to fix a muddy road, they throw out their trash, and dust blows in from the fields. Over decades and centuries, the ground level actually rises. If you've ever wondered why archaeologists always have to dig down to find the past, that's why. Time is literally piled up on top of itself. In a normal, healthy timeline, you expect to see something like this. The bottom layer, Roman ruins, solid stone, red Samian pottery, bronze coins. The middle layer, early medieval debris, rougher pottery, smaller wooden post holes, some simple metal work. The top layer, high medieval and Renaissance structures, large cathedrals, glazed tiles, sophisticated tools. But here is the phantom time bombshell. In hundreds of excavation sites across Europe, archaeologists find the Roman layer, and then, almost immediately on top of it, they find the high medieval layer. The 300-year filling of the cake is either paper-thin or completely missing. The case of the missing cities. Let's look at this horizontally by visiting a few specific sites. Take the city of Frankfurt am Main in Germany. In the 1990s, archaeologists had a rare opportunity to excavate the heart of the city. They were looking for the Carolingian city, the great capital of Charlemagne's successors. They dug, and they dug, and they found nothing. They found plenty of Roman artifact from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They found plenty of late medieval artifacts from the 11th century onwards. But the golden age of the 8th and 9th centuries, it was a ghost town. There were no grand palaces, no bustling marketplaces, and no layers of silt or trash that should have accumulated over 300 years of continuous habitation. This isn't just a Frankfurt problem. From the banks of the Rhine to the plains of France, the story is the same. Historians tell us these were vibrant, populated empires, but the soil tells us the land was either empty or the clock was simply running faster than we thought. The technological amnesia of architecture. Now let's talk about the way we build. Architecture is one of the most reliable ways to track human progress. You don't just forget how to build a dome or a waterproof arch overnight. During the Roman Empire, construction was a high-tech industry. They had waterproof concrete, sophisticated plumbing, and massive stone vaults. Then we are told the empire fell and we entered the Dark Ages. Fine, we expect things to get a bit simpler. But the phantom time theory points out a massive, illogical jump. If you look at Roman architecture from around 300 to 400 AD and compare it to Romanesque architecture from 1000 to 1100 AD, they look like siblings. The Romanesque style, as the name suggests, is a direct evolution of Roman techniques: the rounded arches, the thick stone walls, the sturdy pillars. The problem is the 300-year gap in between. According to mainstream history, for 3 centuries, people stopped building in stone almost entirely. They supposedly lived in wooden huts and forgot how to mix Roman mortar. And then suddenly, in the year 1000, everyone in Europe woke up and said, "Hey, remember those stone arches from 300 years ago? Let's start doing that again exactly where we left off." This is what Illig calls technological amnesia. In any other period of history, technology evolves or decays in a visible curve. Here, it's a flat line followed by a sudden, vertical jump. If you remove those 300 years, the transition from late Roman to Romanesque becomes a natural, logical progression of a few decades, not a miraculous rediscovery after 3 centuries of sleeping in the mud. The Byzantine paradox, the city of Constantinople. To be fair, we can't just look at Western Europe. If France and Germany were dark and empty, what about the Byzantine Empire? Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, was the new Rome. It didn't fall in the 5th century, it thrived. But even in the heart of the most advanced city in the world, the 300-year ghost remains. Archaeologists studying the walls and churches of Constantinople have noted a strange phenomenon: a construction gap between the 7th and 9th centuries. We have records of emperors from this period, sure. We have stories of wars with the Persians and the Arabs. But when you look at the physical fabric of the city, there is almost no new monumental construction during these 3 centuries. The Byzantines, the masters of the dome and the mosaic, apparently just stopped building new things. They maintained the old Roman structures, but they didn't add to them. Does it make sense for a superpower at the height of its administrative capacity to stop building for 300 years? Or is it more likely that the history of those 300 years was stretched out to fill a gap that wasn't actually there? The mystery of the Dark Age, pottery. Let's get even more granular. Let's talk about pottery. Pottery is the plastic of the ancient world. It's cheap, everyone uses it, and when it breaks, it lasts forever in the soil. Roman pottery, especially terra sigillata, was mass-produced in factories and shipped across the entire known world. You can find it in the deserts of Egypt and the hills of Scotland. After the 6th century, this mass production stopped. Historians say this is because trade routes collapsed. But here's the kicker. When trade started up again in the 10th and 11th centuries, the new pottery looked remarkably similar to the old Roman styles. If 300 years had really passed, we would expect to see a slow, messy evolution of styles, different glazes, different shapes, different clay firing techniques. Instead, we see a jump. In many archaeological sites, the Carolingian pottery is so rare and so hard to distinguish from late Roman or early high medieval stuff that it often feels like it's being forced into the timeline. Archaeologists will find a shard of pottery, and say, well, the history books say Charlemagne was here in 800 AD, so this shard must be from 800 AD, even if it looks identical to something from 600 or 1000. It's a classic case of the written word bullying the physical evidence, nature's own record, dust, silt, and peat. Even if humans weren't building palaces or breaking pots, nature doesn't stop. Wind blows dust. Rivers flood and leave layers of silt. Peat bogs grow at a very steady, measurable rate. If you look at a peat bog in Northern Europe, it grows about 1 millimeter per year. Over 300 years, you should see about 30 centimeters, about a foot, of growth. Within that foot of peat, you should find the pollen of the plants that grew during those 3 centuries, giving us a climate record. Yet, when scientists analyze these bogs and lake sediments, the 300-year period from 614 to 911 often shows a compression. The pollen counts and the sediment layers suggest that either the climate didn't change at all for 300 years, or, much more likely, those 300 years didn't actually take that long to pass. The silence of the dead. Finally, let's talk about the people themselves. Where are the graves? Europe has millions of graves from the Roman era. We have millions from the later Middle Ages. But early medieval cemeteries are notoriously difficult to find. When we do find them, they are often small, sparsely populated, and incredibly difficult to date without using circular reasoning. Dating the grave based on a coin, which is dated based on a list of kings which might be fake. If the population of Europe was as large as the Carolingian records suggest, there should be tens of thousands of cemeteries filled with 8th century skeletons. The fact that they are so elusive suggests that the population was either tiny, or that we are looking for people who were never born because the years they were supposed to live in never existed. A horizontal summary of the void. As we wrap up this look at the archaeological crime scene, we see a consistent pattern of absence. Cities that have no 8th century foundations, architects who forgot how to build and then suddenly remembered, pottery that vanished and then reappeared, peat bogs that refused to grow, cemeteries that stayed empty. Mainstream historians explain this by calling it a dark age. They say society collapsed so thoroughly that everyone became invisible to history. But does society collapse so perfectly that even the wind stops blowing dust and the trees stop dropping leaves in the correct amount? Illig's phantom time hypothesis offers an alternative that, while shocking, explains the void perfectly. The reason we can't find anything from the year 700 is that 700 is a fictional label on a timeline that was stretched like a rubber band. In the next part of our journey, we're going to step away from the dirt and look at the conspirators. Who would have the power to pull off a lie this big? Who would want to delete 300 years? And how did they get away with it? We're going to meet the 3 men who might have reinvented time itself. The architects of time, the trio who invented the future. If you want to pull off the greatest heist in human history, you don't rob a bank. You rob the calendar, and you don't do it alone. You need the 3 pillars of medieval society: the sword, the cross, and the pen. According to the phantom time hypothesis, the theft of 300 years wasn't a clerical error or a collective hallucination. It was a calculated, high-stakes political rebranding project orchestrated by the 3 most powerful men on the planet: Meet our suspects: Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus. To understand why they would do this, we have to stop thinking like modern people with digital watches and start thinking like medieval rulers obsessed with destiny, prophecy, and the terrifying magical allure of the number 1000. The obsession. Why the year 1000 mattered. In the late 10th century, the world was holding its breath. The millennium was approaching. Today, we think of the year 2000 as a time for fireworks and computer glitches, Y2K. But in the medieval mind, the year 1000 was something much more visceral. It was the potential date for the second coming of Christ. According to certain interpretations of the Book of Revelation, the saints would reign with Christ for 1,000 years. For a king or an emperor, there was no greater prestige than being the man on the throne when that 1,000-year clock struck midnight. If you were the emperor of the year 1000, you weren't just a politician, you were a key player in the divine plan of the universe. But there was a problem. If the real year was, say, 700 or 750, Otto III and his buddies would be long dead before the party started. They didn't want to be footnotes in a dusty chronicle. They wanted to be the millennial kings. So they did what any absolute ruler would do. They moved the finish line. Suspect number 1. Otto III, the boy who wanted to be. Caesar. Otto III was not your average medieval warlord. He was a teenager with a massive Roman Empire complex. Crowned at the age of 3 and becoming the sole ruler in his teens, he was obsessed with the idea of renovatio imperii Romanorum, the renewal of the Roman Empire. Otto didn't want to just rule Germany or Italy. He wanted to sit in Rome and be the legitimate successor to Augustus and Constantine. He moved his court to Rome, dressed in Greek-style robes, and surrounded himself with ancient ceremony. But there was a gap in his resume. Between the old Rome, which fell in the 5th century, and his new Rome, there was a messy, disorganized void. By padding the timeline with 300 years of glorious ancestors, including the legendary, larger-than-life Charlemagne, Otto could claim a continuous, prestigious lineage. Charlemagne became the bridge that connected Otto back to the ancient Caesars. If Charlemagne was the father of Europe in 800 AD, then Otto III was his rightful, glorious grandson in 1000 AD. It was a masterpiece of political PR. Suspect number 2, Pope Sylvester II, the wizard. Pope. Every ambitious king needs a genius behind the scenes, and Otto had Gerbert of Aurillac, who became Pope Sylvester II. Gerbert was arguably the most intelligent man of his age. He was a mathematician, an astronomer, and a musician. He was so smart that later legends claimed he was a sorcerer who had studied magic in Islamic Spain and possessed a talking bronze head that could predict the future. Sylvester II was the first Frenchman to become pope, and he was Otto's former tutor. He shared Otto's dream of a unified Christian empire. But Sylvester also had the technical skills to pull off a calendar shift. He was one of the few people in Europe who understood how to calculate the complex dates of Easter and how to manipulate the Anno Domini AD system, which was still relatively new and not universally standardized. If Otto provided the political will, Sylvester provided the mathematical shroud. He could rewrite the liturgical calendars, adjust the dating of old documents, and ensure that the Church's vast record-keeping apparatus reflected the new timeline. In a world where 99% of people were illiterate, if the Pope said it was the year 999, who was going to check the math? Suspect number 3, Constantine VII, the king of the library. While Otto and Sylvester were working in the West, they needed someone in the East to play along. Enter the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, aptly nicknamed Porphyrogenitus, born in the purple. Constantine VII wasn't much of a soldier, but he was a world-class scholar. He spent his reign obsessed with books, encyclopedias, and reorganizing history. He oversaw a massive project to collect and summarize all the knowledge of the past. According to the phantom time theory, this was the perfect memory hold operation. Under the guise of preserving history, Constantine's scribes were actually editing it. They could harmonize the Byzantine chronicles with the Western ones, ensuring that the ghost years appeared in the records of both Constantinople and Rome. If the two most powerful empires on Earth agreed on the date, the rest of the world, the Vikings, the Slavs, the small tribes, would eventually fall in line. The mechanism of the lie, how to fake 300 years. You might think, how can you fake 300 years without people noticing? But look at the horizontal reality of life in the 10th century. The information monopoly. There were no newspapers, no internet, and no public libraries. Knowledge was locked in monasteries. If a king and a pope decided to redate a set of chronicles, they only had to convince a few hundred monks. These monks were already accustomed to pious forgeries, creating fake deeds to protect church land. To them, adjusting the year to match a theological goal wouldn't seem like a crime, it would seem like a holy duty. The slow world. In the 900s, news travelled at the speed of a horse. Most people lived and died within 20 miles of where they were born. They didn't have calendars on their walls. They tracked time by the seasons and the local priest's announcements. If the priest started saying, "In the year of our Lord 990, instead of 700, the average peasant wouldn't have the tools or the reason to argue. The AD confusion. The system of counting years from the birth of Christ, Anno Domini, wasn't actually invented until the 6th century by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, and it didn't become popular until centuries later. Before that, people dated things by the regnal year of their king, for example, in the 5th year of King Clovis. This made history a fragmented mess of overlapping mini-timelines. The conspirators simply stitched these fragments together with 300 years of filler characters to reach the desired number. The paper trail of forgery. We have physical evidence that the 10th and 11th centuries were the golden age of forgery. Scholars today admit that a massive percentage of documents from the early Middle Ages are spurious, fake. Take the Carolingian documents, the deeds and laws of Charlemagne. Out of the hundreds of surviving documents, a huge portion has been proven to be later fabrications, written in the 10th or 11th centuries, but backdated to the 800s. Mainstream historians say they were just monks trying to reclaim lost land rights. Illig says they were creating the paper trail for a history that never happened. Imagine a monk in a cold scriptorium in the year 995. His abbot comes to him and says, "We need to prove that our monastery was founded by the great Charlemagne 150 years ago, so the local duke won't tax us." The monk looks at his blank parchment. He doesn't have a record of Charlemagne, so he makes one up. He invents a visit, a speech, and a signature. He repeats this process for other kings in the gap. Multiply this by 1,000 monasteries across Europe, and suddenly you have a history that looks solid because it's everywhere, even if every single piece of it is a lie. The psychological payoff. Why did the common people accept it? Because the year 1000 provided order. The early Middle Ages, the real ones, which Illig says were actually the period immediately following the Roman collapse, were chaotic. By creating a 300-year buffer of stability, legends, and great kings, the rulers of the 10th century were giving their people a sense of identity. They weren't just survivors in a ruined world, they were the heirs to the Holy Roman Empire. It's like a company that's only been in business for 5 years but puts "since 1920" on its logo to look more trustworthy. Otto, Sylvester, and Constantine gave Europe a since 800 AD logo, the horizontal ripple. What about the neighbors? If this was a Western/Byzantine conspiracy, what about the Islamic world? This is where the horizontal investigation gets tricky. The Islamic caliphates were at their peak during the ghost years. They have their own calendars, starting from the Hijra in 622 AD. Illig's supporters argue that the Islamic timeline was also adjusted or misinterpreted by later Western historians to fit the bloated European model. They point out that the early history of Islam is also shrouded in mystery, with a surprising lack of archaeological evidence for the first 100 to 150 years of the Caliphate. However, even if the conspiracy was purely European, it would eventually infect the rest of world history. As Western scholars began to dominate the field of world history in the 18th and 19th centuries, they forced every other culture's timeline to align with their own 300-year era. If the European anchor was wrong, the whole global chain was dragged out of place. Conclusion of the plot. As we look at the trio of Otto, Sylvester, and Constantine, we see a perfect storm of motive and opportunity. They had the motive, the divine year 1000 and political legitimacy, the tools, control over all writing and education, and the opportunity, a dark, illiterate age with no competing records. By the time Otto III died in 1002, at the young age of 21, the theft was complete. The new dates were in the books, the fake deeds were in the archives, and the people believed they were living in the second millennium. The 300-year ghost had been given a name, a crown, and a place in the dirt. But as we've seen, the dirt is hard to fool. In the next part, we're going to look at the global check and balance. We'll travel to Tang Dynasty China and the Maya civilizations of Central America. If 300 years were missing in Europe, did the rest of the world just pause their clocks too? Or does the global evidence prove that Illig's theory is just a beautiful mathematical hallucination? The global alibi. Did the rest of the world pause for Europe? We've spent a lot of time in the damp forests of Germany and the marble halls of Rome, but history doesn't happen in a vacuum. If you delete 300 years from Europe, you're not just erasing Charlemagne's beard, you're pulling a thread that should, in theory, unravel the entire global tapestry. If the years 614 to 911 AD didn't happen in Paris, did they also not happen in Chang'an, Baghdad, or the jungles of the Yucatan? This is the horizontal reality check. For the phantom time hypothesis to be true, the entire world would have to be in on the lie, or at the very least, Everyone's clocks would have to be equally broken. Let's take a trip around the world to see if we can find any companion ghosts in other civilizations. The Chinese giant, the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 AD. If you want to challenge a historian about the phantom time, their first word will likely be China. While Europe was supposedly in its dark age, or not existing at all, China was experiencing one of its most glorious eras, the Tang dynasty. The timeline of the Tang dynasty fits almost perfectly into the phantom slot, 618 to 907 AD. And unlike the European record, which relies on a few shaky monks, the Chinese record-keeping was a massive bureaucratic machine. The Tang dynasty wasn't just a few guys in a tent, it was an empire of 50 million people. They had civil service exams, a massive standing army, and poets like Li Bai and Du Fu, whose works are still memorized by school children today. They had the only female emperor in Chinese history, Wu Zetian, a woman so powerful and controversial that her life is documented in agonizing detail. If 300 years never happened, what do we do with the Tang dynasty? Did the Chinese invent 20 generations of emperors? Did they fake the Aleutian Rebellion, a civil war so massive that some historians believe it resulted in the deaths of millions? Illig and his supporters have a very controversial fix for this. They suggest that Chinese history was synchronized with the West much later. They argue that when Jesuit missionaries arrived in China in the 17th century, they helped align the Chinese chronicles with the European calendar. If the Jesuits brought a bloated 300-year extra calendar from the Vatican, they might have forced the Chinese records to stretch out to match. But this is a tough sell. The Chinese have their own astronomical records, detailed logs of solar eclipses, planetary alignments, and the appearances of Halley's Comet. These celestial events don't care about pious forgeries or papal decrees. They happen when they happen. If a Chinese astronomer in 700 AD recorded an eclipse that matches modern mathematical models for that year, it's a cosmic anchor that tethers that year to reality. The Islamic Golden Age, a world-changing ghost? Now let's look at the Middle East. According to the standard timeline, the year 622 AD marks the Hijra, the journey of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, and the start of the Islamic calendar. The next 300 years, the exact phantom window, saw the most explosive growth of any civilization in history. The Islamic Caliphate spread from Spain to the borders of India. They built the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where they translated Greek philosophy, invented algebra, and advanced medicine while Europe was, supposedly, sleeping. If those 300 years are fake, then the entire foundation of Islamic history has to be re-evaluated. Illig doesn't claim Islam doesn't exist, but he suggests that the speed of its expansion and the dating of its early rulers are off. He points to a lack of coins and lack of archaeological evidence in the first 100 years of the Umayyad Caliphate, but horizontal evidence makes this difficult to maintain. The Islamic world was in constant contact with the Byzantine Empire. They fought wars, signed treaties, and traded goods. If the Byzantines were phantom dating their records, the caliphs in Baghdad would have had to be doing the exact same thing, at the exact same time, using a completely different calendar system, lunar versus solar, and yet somehow ending up with perfectly synchronized dates. The coordination required for such a lie is almost more impossible than the idea of 3 centuries of silence. The Maya, timekeepers of the jungle. Let's hop across the Atlantic to the Americas. While the monks in Europe were supposedly scratching their heads over leap years, the Maya in Central America were arguably the greatest timekeepers in human history. The Maya Classic period, the height of their temple building and city-states like Tikal and Palenque, runs from about 250 AD to 900 AD. They used a system called the long count calendar, which is so precise it can track time for millions of years without losing a second. The Maya recorded their history on stone pillars called stelae. They would carve the exact date of a king's coronation or a victory in war. When we translate these Maya dates into our calendar, they fall right into the 614 to 911 AD gap. For the phantom time hypothesis to work, the Maya would have to have accidentally invented 300 years of history that perfectly aligns with the 300 years the Europeans intentionally faked. Again, we run into the astronomy problem. The Maya were obsessed with the movements of Venus and the Sun. Their stone records are tied to the sky. Unless the stars themselves took a 300-year nap, it's hard to argue the Maya timeline is a fiction. The Silk Road, the thread that binds. If we look at the world horizontally, can we see a web of trade called the Silk Road. This wasn't just one road, it was a network of merchants, camels and ships connecting China to Rome, and later to the Middle Ages. If 300 years are missing in the middle, the logs of the Silk Road should show a massive 300-year break. We should see Chinese silk being produced in 600 AD, then a total silence, and then silk reappearing in 900 AD. Instead, what we see is a gradual shift. We see the spread of paper-making technology from China to the Arab world after the Battle of Talas in 751 AD. We see the spread of new types of crops and spices. These transitions take time. They move at the speed of human travel and cultural exchange. A 300-year jump would look like a teleportation of technology. One day, nobody knows how to make paper. The next day, 300 years later, paper mills are everywhere. The historical record shows a much slower, more natural horizontal spread. The aha moment. Why the theory still lives. So if the global evidence is so stacked against the phantom time, why does anyone still talk about it? Why did you click on this video? Because horizontal history has a few weird glitches that Illig is very good at pointing out. The Dark Age synchronization. Isn't it a bit weird that so many civilizations around the world have a collapse or a dark period around the same time? The Maya collapse happens around 800 to 900 AD. The Tang dynasty falls in 907 AD. The Abbasid Caliphate begins to fracture. Western Europe is in its Dark Age. Mainstream history says this was a global climate event or a systemic collapse of trade. Phantom Time says this is the seam where the fake history was stitched onto the real history. The absence of cross-references. While there are some references between empires, there are surprisingly few official diplomatic letters between, say, Charlemagne and the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. There is a legendary story about Harun al-Rashid sending Charlemagne an elephant named Abul Abbas, but some skeptics argue this story was invented later to make Charlemagne look more important on the world stage. The Viking gap. Even the Vikings, the ultimate world travelers of the 8th and 9th centuries, have a weird history. Much of our knowledge of the Vikings comes from sagas written down hundreds of years later. In the actual ground, early Viking sites are often difficult to date precisely without relying on, you guessed it, those same potentially bloated calendars. The scientific gavel, tree rings, and ice cores. To settle the global debate, we have to look at the most unbiased witnesses of all, trees and ice. Scientists have drilled deep into the ice of Greenland and Antarctica. These ice cores contain layers of snow from every single year, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Within those layers, they find ash from volcanic eruptions. If a volcano erupted in 650 AD, we should see that ash layer. If we count the layers from today back to then, we can see exactly how many years have passed. The ice cores tell us that the years between 614 and 911 did happen. There are 297 layers of ice there. The same goes for dendrochronology, tree rings. By looking at old oaks in Germany or bristlecone pines in California, scientists have built a year-by-year calendar of the Earth's climate. These rings don't have a political agenda. They don't care about Otto III's ego. And they show a continuous sequence of years through the phantom period. Final thoughts on the global perspective. When we look horizontally across the Earth, the phantom time hypothesis starts to feel like a very Eurocentric theory. It works if you only look at a few confusing centuries in Germany and France, where records were sparse and monks were shifty. But as soon as you pan the camera out to include the astronomers of China, the mathematicians of Baghdad, and the calendar-obsessed kings of the Maya, the theory runs into a wall of too many witnesses. For 300 years to be fake, the entire human race would have to have collectively hallucinated a world of poetry, war, science, and trade, and then buried the evidence in the ice of the North Pole and the rings of the oldest trees on Earth. However, the fact that we can even ask these questions, the fact that the Dark Ages are so empty that such a wild theory can even breathe, is a testament to how much we still don't know about our own past. In the next part, we're going to look at the hard science of the rebuttal. We'll look at how modern technology finally puts the phantom to rest, and why, despite all the evidence against it, the idea of stolen time continues to fascinate our modern minds. We are going to look at the death of the ghost, the scientific verdict, when the atoms and stars speak. We have travelled through the corridors of power, looked into the silent layers of the earth, and scanned the records of empires across the globe. But in the 21st century, history isn't just a matter of he said, she said, between monks and modern skeptics. We have something the 10th century didn't have, the ability to peer into the very atoms of the past. To conclude our horizontal investigation, we must bring the phantom time hypothesis into the laboratory. If Heribert Illig is right, the laws of physics and the movements of the planets would have to be part of the conspiracy. But as we are about to see, science is a very difficult witness to bribe. This is where we look at the hard evidence, the tree rings, the carbon isotopes, and the clockwork of the heavens, to see why the ghost time ultimately fades under the light of modern technology. The tree's diary. Dendrochronology. Imagine you are walking through a forest. Every tree around you is a living, breathing record keeper. Every year, a tree adds a new ring to its trunk. In a good, rainy year, the ring is wide. In a year of drought or frost, the ring is narrow. This creates a unique fingerprint of time, Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, is perhaps the most devastating blow to the idea that 300 years are missing. Scientists don't just look at one tree, they use a method called cross-dating. They find an old building with an oak beam, match its outer rings to the inner rings of a living tree, and then find an even older log preserved in a bog to match with that beam. By overlapping these patterns like a giant jigsaw puzzle, they have created a master chronology that goes back over 10,000 years. In Europe, specifically in Germany, the heart of Illig's theory, researchers like Bernd Becker developed a master oak chronology. When they look at the period from 614 to 911 AD, they don't see a gap. They see 297 distinct individual rings. Each ring tells a story of a specific summer, some hot, some cold. If those 300 years were a phantom, the tree rings would show a jump. You would have the year 614, and then the very next ring would have the climate signature of 911. But that's not what we find. We find a continuous year-by-year sequence. For Illig to be right, nature itself would have had to fake 300 years of weather, and thousands of trees across the world would have had to grow fake rings in perfect unison. In the world of science, that's a bridge too far. The atomic clock, radiocarbon, dating. While tree rings give us a year-by-year count, radiocarbon dating, carbon-14, gives us an age based on the decay of atoms. Everything living, you, me, the grass, the cows, absorbs a tiny amount of a radioactive isotope called carbon-14 from the atmosphere. The moment an organism dies, it stops absorbing carbon-14 and the clock starts ticking. The isotope decays at a very steady, predictable rate, its half-life. Archaeologists have tested thousands of objects that supposedly come from the phantom years. They have tested the silk from the burial shrouds of early kings, the wooden posts of Saxon huts, and the parchment of manuscripts. If the year 750 AD didn't exist, an object labeled 750 AD would actually be much younger, from the thousands, or much older. But when we put these artifacts into a particle accelerator, the results consistently point to the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. For example, consider the pollen trapped in the layers of lake beds. Scientists can date the organic material in those layers. They see the shift in agriculture, the types of trees that were growing, and the impact of human farming. And these biological markers don't skip a beat. They show a world that was very much alive and farming during the centuries Illig claims were empty air. The unchangeable sky, astronomy as the ultimate anchor. If you can't trust the trees and you can't trust the atoms, you have to trust the stars. The universe is a giant mathematical machine. The planets move in predictable orbits, and events like solar eclipses and the passage of comets follow the laws of physics. One of the strongest arguments against phantom time is retrocalculation. Modern astronomers can use computers to calculate exactly where and when a solar eclipse would have been visible 1,500 years ago. We have records from the missing 300 years that describe these events in great detail. In 840 AD, there was a major solar eclipse that supposedly terrified the Frankish emperor Louis the Pious, so much that he died shortly after. If we check the astronomical math, was there an eclipse in 840 AD? Yes. There was a total solar eclipse visible in Europe on May 5th, 840. If the year 840 AD never happened, why does the math of the spheres match the stories of the monks? And then there is Halley's Comet. This famous comet visits Earth roughly every 76 years. It was recorded by the Chinese in 684, 760, and 837 AD. It was also recorded by Western chroniclers. These sightings line up perfectly with the comet's orbit. For Illig to be right, the comet would have had to change its orbital physics to wait for the calendar to catch up, or the chroniclers of China and Europe would have had to collaborate to invent fake comet sightings that just happened to match a mathematical orbit they didn't even understand yet. The 10-day glitch revisited. Why the math actually works. Earlier, we talked about the core of Illig's argument, the 10-day skip in the Gregorian calendar. He argued that the math only works if you remove 300 years, but mainstream scientists and historians have a much simpler explanation. When Pope Gregory XIII corrected the calendar in 1582, he wasn't trying to reset the clock all the way back to the time of Julius Caesar in 45 BC. He was trying to reset it to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Why 325 AD? Because that was when the Christian Church officially set the rules for calculating Easter. The Church didn't care about Caesar's original date. They cared about the date the Church had stamped as the official baseline for their holiest day. If you calculate the drift from 325 AD to 1582 AD, about 1,257 years, the 10-day correction is almost exactly correct. 128 years per day, 1,257 years, approximately 9.8 days. The 300-year error that Illig found wasn't a hole in history, it was just a misunderstanding of which starting line the Pope was using. Once you realize the Church was starting from 325 AD, the missing days disappear, and the 300 ghost years are no longer needed to balance the books. Why the myth persists. If science has solved the case, why does the phantom time hypothesis still have followers? Why is it one of the most popular alternative histories on the internet? It's because the theory speaks to a very human feeling, the sense that the Dark Ages are a mystery. We call them the Dark Ages because we have so few records, so little art, and so few buildings compared to the Romans. It feels like a gap. Illig's theory takes that feeling of a gap and gives it a literal, exciting explanation. It turns a boring period of history into a thrilling detective story. It also appeals to our natural distrust of authority. The idea that a pope and an emperor could sit in a room and lie to the entire world for 1,000 years is a seductive conspiracy. It makes us feel like we are the ones who finally woke up and saw the truth that everyone else is too blind to see. Conclusion. The real stolen time. As we conclude this scientific deep dive, we have to admit that while the phantom time hypothesis is brilliant, creative, and fun to think about, it is almost certainly wrong. The trees don't lie, the atoms don't lie, and the stars don't lie. The years 614 to 911 AD were real. They were centuries filled with real people who lived, loved, fought, and died. They were years of struggle where the foundations of the modern world were slowly, painfully laid down. To call them phantom years is, in a way, to steal the lives of everyone who lived through them. The Dark Ages weren't empty because they didn't exist. They were dark because we haven't found all the flashlights yet. Every year, archaeologists find new coins, new huts, and new manuscripts that fill in the void. History isn't a finished book, it's an ongoing investigation. So, what have we learned? We've learned that time is more than just numbers on a page. It's a physical reality written into the rings of an oak tree and the light of a passing comet. We've learned that even the most powerful emperor can't truly steal a single day, let alone 3 centuries. But most importantly, we've learned to look closer. We've learned that the most interesting stories aren't always the ones in the history books, and they aren't always the ones in the conspiracy theories. The most interesting story is the truth, a messy, complicated, 2026-year-long journey that is still being written by people like you and me. Thank you for sticking with me through this 16,000-word journey into the shadows of the past. If you enjoyed this horizontal deep dive, make sure you've hit that like button. Tell me in the comments, are you convinced by the tree rings, or do you still think there's a ghost in the calendar? Until next time, keep questioning the timeline. Closing the case, the legacy of the stolen centuries. We have finally reached the end of our 16,000-word odyssey through the shadows of the early Middle Ages. We began this journey as time detectives, fueled by a radical suspicion that our history books might be a 300-year-long work of fiction. We've scrutinized the mathematical glitch of the Gregorian calendar, searched for the ghost of Charlemagne in the empty soil of Aachen, and looked for missing time in the tree rings of Germany and the stone stelae of the Maya. The phantom time hypothesis is more than just a fringe theory. It is a masterclass in the importance of critical thinking. It teaches us that history is not a static, finished statue, but a living, breathing narrative that we are constantly re-evaluating. While the hard science of dendrochronology and astronomy ultimately protects the timeline from being erased, the theory reminds us to always ask, who wrote this? What was their motive? And where is the physical evidence? True wisdom lies in the balance between healthy skepticism and the acceptance of verified facts. It's okay to wonder if a king was too perfect to be real, or why a city shows no trash for a century. Those questions drive archaeologists to dig deeper and scientists to refine their tools. Even though the 300 years weren't stolen by a pope or an emperor, the mystery they left behind has enriched our understanding of how fragile our connection to the past can be. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from what time it is there. I hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on the world you live in, whether it's 2026 or 1729. The visuals were here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Your curiosity is the only tool you truly needed. Thank you for joining me on this marathon through time. Until the next mystery, keep your eyes on the stars and your feet on the evidence. Next step. Would you like me to compile all these parts into a single, cohesive script document, or create a summary table of the key pros and cons of the phantom time hypothesis for your quick reference?